This next panel will look at how we collaborate to take therapies into and through the clinic. To moderate, please join me in welcoming Wendy Erla, the Vice President of Patient Advocacy and Market Insights at Wave Life Sciences. Wendy?
Good afternoon. I'm one of the lucky ones in the room that's been able to work in patient advocacy on the manufacturer, sponsor, whatever you call this exciting world of drug discovery. I've been on that side for my whole career. And I started early as a field sales rep with Glaxo, when Glaxo was Glaxo, so before it became the behemoth organization it is today. And I was so proud to be in a sales organization for a company that was making drugs for really difficult to treat conditions, from GI problems with Zantac, to migraine, to oncology and HIV. So all of those conditions are important if you're the patient that has them. The industry changed and sales became, I'm a drug rep, and it really bothered me because I believe fundamentally that all of us together, advocacy and manufacturers, the drug development process, we're doing really good work. I transitioned into patient advocacy, first in oncology and then in rare disease with Biogen. And at Biogen, that was a really small function because we were just getting into rare disease. So I was really fortunate to work in ALS and SMA, hemophilia. And in January, I joined a preclinical company. So for most of you know what that means, but we're in the very early stages of drug development. I work with almost all scientists, brilliant people. But it was really important to our leadership team at Wave and our board of directors that we walk the talk of having the patient voice at the table. And it presented such a unique opportunity for me to bring a lifetime career of experience to an organization that really wants to have tangible, articulate ways that we bring the patient voice to the table throughout the clinical trial, drug development, and eventually commercialization process. So it's a unique experience in that we are so early and we talk a lot about what's the right time to engage, but it really is supported from our board of directors and our CEO all throughout our organization. I'm very privileged today to share the panel with Kenneth Hobby, who is the president of Cure SMA, and somebody that he's collaborated with for a long time in the SMA space, Jillian Mullins, who's with Biogen. And then we also are joined by Jan Nilsson, who is with Cardinal Health and has a lot of great input on where this advocacy piece is important, even from a drug delivery and patient services perspective.
Go ahead. I was going to say on the far end, so
Okay.
go ahead.
Welcome, everybody. Let's start with some introductions. Jillian?
Thank you. So I'm Jillian Mullins. I'm the Director of Patient Advocacy at Biogen. Biogen is a company located here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We have several approved therapies for multiple sclerosis, but I have the distinct privilege of really working in our pipeline space. So my role at Biogen is to partner with patient advocacy organizations in that really early, as Wendy said, preclinical phase all the way through development to make sure that we're incorporating patient perspectives from soup to nuts. And I'll turn it over to Kenneth.
So I'm from a patient community that's focused on spinal muscular atrophy, SMA. A little background on the disease for people that don't know. It's the #1 genetic cause of death of infants. There's about 1 in 50 people who are carriers of the genetic cause of this disease. So it's something that surprises a lot of people. There's probably 7-8 million people in the US who have this genetic issue going on. And then it's a terrible disease. A lot of people look at it as very similar to ALS, but affecting infants. We're an organization that's come about from the community. We really started off from a very grassroots approach with families just getting together on an informal basis to support each other. Really just kind of helping each other out with emotional support, information about the disease. What we've done though over about 32 years now is build from that grassroots start to what we'd like to say is a much more sophisticated organization where we do an awful lot of fundraising from our families. We've raised about $60 million that we put into research. We've also taken, I think, a very sophisticated approach on the research as well, building a pipeline of therapies. And we're actually at the point now where we have 18 therapies that are in development. 6 of those are in clinical trials. And one of those just earlier this week actually reached that point of getting a new drug application. So we've built up this community. From grassroots to this point where we're really on the cusp now of actually getting a therapy for our families. And while it's turned into this kind of research foundation, fundraising, the real core of it is the families, the grassroots. That's what's built the community, kept it together. And it's actually a key part that I think we'll get into, where we have this community, we have a huge database of families who are part of this database, not really for the therapies, the cures that are coming, but for that support. But that database is something which has been, I think, critical when we look at the clinical trials, the stage that we've moved into now, and actually how we've been participating with partners, with companies over the last few years.
Thank you. Jan?
Hi, I'm Jan Nielsen, and I'm the Division President for Access and Patient Support, Synexus at Cardinal Health. And so I'm an RN. I started out in trauma care and ended up going up through the organization and eventually became a hospital administrator, and then got into renal disease. And from there started looking at diseases and the process. And I felt that at the bedside, I wasn't having the ability to actually change and get ahead of the game for our patients that were coming through the door. So as I got in working with manufacturers, started looking at ultra-orphan and orphan disease states, and had an opportunity to actually launch Synexus myself, and looking to help facilitate scientists who wanted to bring drugs to commercialization, and actually looking at the opportunities there with getting breakthrough therapies out to unmet need populations. And so those are the services that we provide today, all the way from trial setting through commercialization.
Thank you. So Jillian, let's start with you. And then we, as a panel, really wanted to make this more of a discussion and a conversation. So that's the approach we're going to take. And we hope that you all learn a little bit about us and how our approach to advocacy and the drug development process operates, but also that'll open up an opportunity for you all to ask questions. But one of the fundamental questions that was discussed a little bit this morning is, how early should medical drug companies engage with patient advocacy, and what does that engagement look like in the beginning?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir with this audience here, but I would say preclinical. I mean, I think you've seen this entire shift, really, when you look at how industry and nonprofit advocacy organizations are engaging together. Kenneth touched on a really important point, which is data. Data drives so much decision making, and when I think companies are looking at the different disease spaces that they're getting involved in, there's obviously the R&D side, but there's also the learnings that we have from patient communities, and the best harborer of that data are the nonprofit organizations. They have a wealth of information. So, sometimes people say, what about expectation setting? We don't know if this is something we will ultimately take into the clinic, or maybe if you're in the early phases, everybody's probably seen the chart of how everything gets narrowed and down to one potential compound. Are we setting the wrong expectations with being really out there about what we're looking at? I think no. I think it all kind of comes down to the communication that you have at the outset between the advocacy organizations and the company about what the objectives are on both sides. But we certainly have so much to learn, and I think there's no better place to start in those early stages. I don't know if I know the panel agrees, but I don't know what your experience has been with other companies as well.
And it definitely is early. I think we look at it definitely as a two-way street when we're talking about this. It's the information that we have that can be valuable to companies, clinical trials, the data that we can provide to get those clinical trials set up, the outcome measures, recruit into those successfully. So that's information that we have that, you're setting those clinical trials up for success if you plan that up front before you even start out. But I think for us as well on the family side, it's a two-way street where our families want the information on the programs. They do want to see which programs are in the clinic, what the potential benefits could be. A lot of families, I think, in our community, they make choices about care today, what they're doing today with their children, based on what the hopes and the expectations are on clinical trials and the timelines to therapies. So our families are very interested. They They educate themselves on programs that are out there, and really any information that's put out, our families want to get, and they become very knowledgeable about programs. So I think we always look at it that it's better to have that information coming to us from the companies. What we see is if there's a void, if there's a vacuum where some companies are being quiet, our families will fill that in themselves, and there's kind of more concerns if there isn't information coming from a program. So our families want that information early on. I think it gives them the perspective of the right expectations over time of what might be coming down the line.
And then from my perspective, I agree 100% that it needs to be early. But where I see manufacturers often miss the boat is an opportunity to understand the patient journey. So if they sit down with a patient advocacy group, they will understand what it took for the patient to even be diagnosed. What was the process? What are the different cultures that you're interacting with, and get that insight so as you design the trial, it really is a trial that one can recruit into, as well that it's functional and can go on to commercialization. And then continuing to work with the patient advocacy groups to understand way beyond commercialization, how are you going to educate physicians? Because again, as we were talking, the panel, you have key thought leaders, but that's a very small population of the physician population that's out there treating. So how do you continue to get that education out? You need the patient advocacy groups to help facilitate that, as well as your continued education process around the specific medication, et cetera. So from beginning to end, patient advocacy groups need to be brought in.
One of the things that we're trying to do in this very early stage is also involve patients in the full discussion. So the clinical trial protocol design, but also there's a lot of discussion around regulatory endpoints, and are they the right endpoints? And they may not seem right to the patients themselves or the caregivers, but that's what's been approved and validated by the FDA and will ensure a faster process through the FDA. So having this open communication around, we might have to sacrifice here, but it'll really inform and embolden our phase 2 and get us there more quickly. But that patient voice at the table and the caregiver voice at the table has been really critical.
And I think there are other, I think sometimes the challenge with, I think a lot of us can point to making sure we're incorporating patient perspectives, whether it's through patient preference studies, through advisory boards, through focus groups, through surveys into that clinical design. I think one of the things that we've tried to think about is, within the company, there's many different departments that are working to pull that protocol together and that program together. And the clinical development people are really the ones thinking, I need to answer this scientific question, and I need to execute these number of tests to help me get to that answer. What I think we've found is by having advocacy organizations and patients at the table in those discussions, there's a really good dialogue about are all of those because you get into an operations piece, right? So not only we need to answer this scientific question, but then from the community, well, how feasible is that to do based on how you think you need to answer the question? And I think it causes a lot of really good internal thinking, and that ultimately reduces some of the barriers to participation in clinical trials. And I've heard that from a lot of different industry partners and a lot of advocacy organizations who've provided that input. Just have you thought about the practical nature of the disease and what this test that you're asking for is really going to mean on top of everything else this family is dealing with? So I think that's another important piece when you're engaging, with companies back and forth, is that it shouldn't ever just be really with one function or one department. I think our role is to bridge those gaps between organizations and the companies, but it has to be not only across the development continuum, but really functionally across the company. And obviously, larger companies, I think that sometimes gets harder to pull through, but there are challenges, I think, across the board, regardless of size.
I think one thing that we've seen as well, so we're looking at kind of the practical side of having the patient voice, patient data go into the design of clinical trials, but I think as well it's been very valuable while those trials have been going on to get them conducted successfully. Mm-hmm. I think the involvement up front of patients in the design of trials and then the education while they're going on, I think has been very important. We've had a number of placebo-controlled trials going on, and for the education for the families to know why that's important, what the benefit is to having a placebo-controlled trial done in the long run for the benefit of the community. I think that's something that we focused a lot on educating the community on, and I think and I hope it's actually been successful in allowing those clinical trials to recruit and retain patients in them as well as they've gone along.
So kind of speak to that a little bit more, because that I think is a really good point about it helps advance programs through the clinic. What does that education look like tactically? Is it WebExes? How does that happen?
So some of the standard things with booklets, material that we have on our website, and social media as well, really kind of putting information out through these indirect channels to our whole community. But I think we've, over the years, built some other programs as well with direct interactions. So having families come into companies to talk about their experience and learn from the companies directly one-on-one. We put a big annual conference on every year. And our conference, we look at it as something special which talks about our community, where we bring as many families as we can and many researchers as we can together in one place. And there's a number of activities that we have going on at that conference, which I think accomplish a lot of these goals as well. One thing that we did is we actually had a lot of our patients that would try to sneak into the research meeting and try and get into the poster session. And in the end, though, we wondered why we were trying to stop it. So we still have that closed off on the research meeting, but we actually set up a family-friendly researcher poster session. Our families go in, and I think we had about 40 companies and organizations that have posters talking directly to families and having that kind of sharing information one-on-one. So I think it's the combination, indirect, broad, but where you can set up direct one-to-one sharing of information.
So along those lines, we've seen mobile applications. So where that patient, the caregiver, the trial site navigator can go ahead and have a mobile application that they're all logging information in. So the latest information is there. There's an opportunity also for the patient or the caregiver to post other questions. And so there's a constant back and forth. And then what happens out of that is the opportunity to sit, as you move further along that trial, is starting to mark all of barriers or issues that came about, so that as you address going into commercialization, what are the services that need to be put in place to support that patient? And then vetting that out again with the advocacy group, that these are the things that we think we need to have in place to support the patient going into commercialization.
So I think that's really a critical point, to capture those learnings. I think there's a tendency to go from phase 1 to phase 2 to just go through the process, but actually capturing the trial learnings and how that applies to the population at large is really critical. You mentioned services, and that's an area where your company has such expertise, but what types of things do companies need to be thinking about, and when during the drug development process do those considerations need to be made?
Well, even as you set up the trial, and I've seen manufacturers say, oh, well, the patient will have to have a nephrectomy. The patient will have to have this specific apheresis done. And what you need to understand is every one of those components in the commercialized world has a copay. And when you go to commercialization, it may not be a bundled price. And so there are separate copays. And so you're going to need reimbursement services wrapped around that. And how are you going to walk a patient through? And then again, when you're looking at your clinical data, is really looking at what specific indication and at what is the indication at third stage, fourth stage, what's the patient profile look? Because again, that falls into reimbursement. Have they met all of their out-of-pocket needs? By the time you are, fourth stage, you may have already spent quite a bit of those dollars, and you've spun down to Medicaid or Medicare. And so again, when you commercialize, it's really pulling in those learnings from the trial, looking at the patient population. So again, those wraparound services are appropriate. I've seen drugs fail, as I'm sure many of you have, because the services weren't wrapped around appropriately. And so then the prescriber was not prescribing.
I think the common theme we're all hearing is that the learnings every step of the way are so critical. And I'll share a story. We had a patient into our organization last week, and she was a dynamic, magnificent ambassador for what we need to do right. But she shared a clinical trial story. She found out she had this disease, and she quit her job because she's going to do everything she can to move research forward. So literally, she's devoted herself to the research process, and she's in a clinical trial. So she got diagnosed 6 months ago. She started a clinical trial about a week ago. So really committed. She was very engaged, very excited, very knowledgeable, a community scientist, to coin the phrase we heard this morning. And she went for her first trial visit, and part of the trial protocol requires an MRI. And she has an IUD, and she was turned away from the MRI because of the metal in her IUD. Now, during the protocol process and the informed consent, she'd been asked if she was on birth control, and she said yes. She wasn't asked the follow-up questions. And that was a real lesson to our organization that we can't make assumptions. So from the patient perspective, that she felt like a failure for her entire community because she was sure she wouldn't be able to enroll in this trial now. So it was devastating over something that could have been so simple. So I think those learnings all along the way become very critical to be captured. And Jillian was sharing that the role of patient advocacy really is this bridge between all the different functions in the organization. So taking those learnings and sharing them with everybody. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think it's all along the pathway, right? Like, I think that a lot of really great organizations are trying to put some, I'm trying to think of the right word, structure around what this looks like. So CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, everybody's probably familiar with their slide kind of about the drug development continuum, but they're now giving these great, more like Excel spreadsheets of all the questions that you need to be asking. And I think the important thing to remember is that when we ask all of these questions of patients and advocacy organizations in phase 1, that is still really valuable data in phase 3. And so when we think about these questions, I know we're trying to pivot and think through, okay, we have a lot of information we need to get, and that's going to be really helpful for those early stage studies. How can we go back and measure against what patients were telling us here and what they're telling us now? So I think the learnings are critical, and then pulling them all the way through is what I think, frankly, is more of a challenge, because it's different departments, it's different people, it's different questions maybe that are being asked, but still really valuable learnings. So I think that's, to me, that's one of the biggest things that the science of patient input is evolving to. And, those aren't just anecdotal learnings, right? They're rooted in some really serious data. So how do we get smarter and better about doing that and make sure that we pull them all the way through? And I think some of these tools that are being developed by CITI and Faster Cures and others are going to be really helpful for all of us as a roadmap moving forward to better explain how we utilize this data every step of the way.
I think there's another perspective that we have as a patient advocacy group on kind of the learning process as well. So we're lucky enough that we have multiple clinical trials, multiple companies that are involved in our field. So we look at ourselves as, how do we learn from multiple trials? How do we share the learnings from one company's trial experience to make sure that we have success in other ones? So we look for that ability to learn across companies. I think as well, a perspective that we have from that angle is looking to reduce the burden for patients as well. We have a number of companies that are coming into the clinic, and we'll often have kind of similar requests for the same surveys to happen to the patient community. And it's a burden sometimes to repeat the same questions over and over with our patient population. So we've tried to look for opportunities to bring companies together to consolidate requests into kind of one master survey on the same topic. So we're often looking for kind of those efficiencies to have learning from trials, but reduce the burden as well for families.
And I think we try and pull it across different therapeutic areas too, regardless of the size of the patient population or the disease. There are always key learnings. I think another one is not only the patient perspective, but also that surrounding network. So I know obviously Cure SMA does a ton with the family, and that's true in rare disease, that's true in large disease states, and that's another kind of data point that I think needs to be pulled through.
And I think what's key, going back to the patient advocacy groups, as you talk about this consolidated data, they can give insight into the academic centers as well as out into the community setting. It's one thing to work with a very large academic center and have all that expertise and all the different services that may be around that trial and then into commercialization. But when you go across several different large academic settings, the culture is very different in each of them. But if you go back to your patient advocacy group, they can help facilitate that and provide you that information. Again, sharing the knowledge.
Fantastic. Jillian, you mentioned, I think in rare disease, patient advocacy has such an organic nature because it's often the patient community to even the origins of your organization that really drive the outward awareness and learnings and drive the research. In a larger disease state, so you work in Alzheimer's disease, how is the patient advocacy approach to moving drugs into and through the clinic different?
Yeah, so I think that the core stays the same. I think that the tools that you're using are still the same to get that input. I think there are probably bigger and more organizations to navigate just from an industry point of view. I know one of the things we were talking about before is kind of working with multiple stakeholders in different disease states. Is that good or bad? I think it's great across the board because every different organization has a different strength and something different to bring to the table. Going back to that discussion about setting the expectations early about what you hope to achieve from each other, I think is really important. But if you take a disease like Alzheimer's, we're doing all of the same learning that we did with SMA. We're earlier kind of in our development there, but we're still meeting with patients, with their caregivers, in formalized and informalized ways, just to get an understanding of what the burden of their disease is like. And it's going to be different for every single patient. And that's where the advocacy organizations come in to say holistically, here are the top most important things we hear. So we can take the individual stories, we can layer that on top of this kind of wealth of data that the advocacy organizations have to draw conclusions about study design, about recruitment, and all of those things.
Kenneth, one of the early experiences that you had in working with sponsor partners on drug development was also advocating for newborn screening. And so a lot of the times we're so focused on the drug development piece of the process, but there are these ancillary programs and endpoint design and things that come up along the process that are as important. What was your experience in working with the industry side as well as the regulation government side that's on developing newborn screening initiatives?
So I think that fits in what you're saying, where you've got the therapeutic development programs that are ongoing, but there's things such as newborn screening, the diagnosis, reducing kind of the diagnosis time. If you're talking as well about, what we look at is building capacity when we have these therapies come through, where are our patients actually going to go to get access to the therapies? So it's kind of that diagnosis access layer that goes on top of individual therapies. I think we're very active in that area because I think we see that's something which is going to have a broader perspective than any one particular program. So I think it's another area where we look to bring in several companies, and then it does go beyond that when you're talking about the additional stakeholders at the state level, at the federal level with the RUSP and things like that as well. It's been a very long process for us. I think we knew that when we were kind of getting into it, that it was something that you had to spend a lot of time up front, and I think we even started about 7 years ago, talking with the federal panel, looking for what information, data they were going to require for us to be able to get on to the panel. I think then we actually started to take some of that information and funnel that back to some of our corporate partners as well to say, one, we need a therapy. That's one of the key milestones that we need before newborn screening. But also we need some specific data to go along with it as well. We need some data coming from trials from the companies that we can take and actually put into the application for newborn screening. So it's a bit of a reverse role in a way there, where we were looking to get data back from the companies to support our efforts.
I think one of the hallmarks of that initiative was the collaboration between the manufacturers as well. So getting people in a room that are all developing unique and different drugs for SMA in this case, that would be seen as competitors, but there was this common mission of developing newborn screening. And the conversation and the alignment started well before any of these companies was far along in the clinic, knowing that it could take 7 to 10 years to advance. But getting that collaboration on the manufacturer side hasn't always been as natural, and it was really facilitated by the advocacy organization.
And it's worked quite well, definitely on the newborn screening side, but that's actually what's translated over to some of the sharing that we're getting in clinical trials now, talking about patient education, physician education. We actually have about 7 companies in our space that work together very well. So I think that was a nice initial foundation that set up how we were expecting companies to actually work together for the greater good of our community as well.
And I think there's a large opportunity there to tap into the patient advocacy groups, to lead the education, discussion across the United States. And I'll give you an example of that. So if you have manufacturers that will come together behind the scenes working to create, for example, the screening process. And then by having the patient advocacy groups be the ones that are taking out and doing the PR component, educating the world about this screening, because as we talked about behind the scenes, there are some states, some payers, there is no screening approved, even though it's available. And so by having the advocacy groups lead, we, the service organizations, as well as the manufacturers, help support those manufacturers in getting that word out. I think it will be well received, and it can change the perspective of how the world is looking at drug manufacturers and taking it out of that more selfish mode, if you would. So just a thought.
I think there's also been a lot of trending into this kind of, I think you see it small organizations to large organizations leading the way in terms of either industry consortiums, research roundtables. Most of the advocacy organizations that we work with have scientific and medical advisory boards, and they drive a lot of the agenda, and that's incredibly valuable for us to learn from those people. So I know that's something that you've created. It's something that exists going back to Alzheimer's disease as well, where all the companies are together in this kind of setting where there isn't, really a disease-modifying therapy, and what are the scientific questions that we need to work together, share data, and answer. And it's the advocacy organizations that drive that. It's in everybody's best interest to be a part of it. I think we get so much out of that opportunity. Just to echo, I think, on what you're saying.
One of the tactical parts of clinical trial design is actually enrolling patients in a trial. And in several of the areas we've all worked in, the data comes back that a vast majority of patients are not even offered the opportunity to be in a trial. So can you speak to how working with advocacy organizations like yours could improve that?
So I think we've been pretty successful recruiting into the trials themselves. We haven't had a problem so far in fully recruiting, getting people into those. I think that comes from that kind of education, the early involvement of people in the planning of those trials. I think as well, one aspect that we see is clinical trials are obviously something that a lot of people are interested in participating in. It's something that while we kind of try to make sure people have the right expectations, it's a chance to try out a therapy. People want to participate. In our community, in our disease, people are looking for something to do, to be proactive, to fight against this disease. So the chance to participate in a clinical trial is one of those opportunities, and I think people jump at that chance to get in. What we try and do as well, I think, is educate that those are limited opportunities. The idea behind the trial is to move as rapidly as possible to get the approval. And so we're often actually looking to match up additional opportunities alongside clinical trial participation for people to be involved in that process. So when we're talking about studies, focus groups, surveys that people can be involved in that are not just clinical trials, we show the value of that to the overall process of getting a therapy approved for the whole community. And we actually see a great interest, a great value for our families to, again, participate in something like that. We saw some interesting dynamics where when we were putting surveys and focus groups out, we actually had to make recommendations never to give a financial incentive. It was kind of standard to offer a gift card or financial incentive for a family to participate. We found that families actually saw that as kind of maybe reducing the value. They saw it as a greater good to participate in a market research study or a focus group for a clinical trial design for the greater good of the community and the research progress. And a financial incentive actually caused some questions on what was the motive here and whether they should be doing it.
That's fascinating. Jan, can you talk a little bit about, I know we touched on the actual pull-through process of what organizations and advocacy groups need to think about from a patient services perspective. Does that, in your mind, start, I know their engagement starts very early, but the actual availability and deployment of services, is that at drug approval? Is that start of phase 3? What have you seen work with the best?
Well, I've seen the trend has been to do it at commercialization. What we're trying to educate is you need to do it in phase 3 and be thinking about it even as you enter into phase 3 and how you're going to crosswalk into commercialization. One, working with the advocacy groups again to really be educating that patient population. And then as you move into the commercialization, really be thinking about the services. We see many manufacturers thinking about having what I refer to as a patient advocate or maybe a personal navigator from the patient population. And what we are suggesting is that you go back to the patient advocacy groups, help them put the constraints, the protocol, the process, the vetting out back with the advocacy group so that they can really tee up the appropriate types of individuals. They're going to be educating their peers, patients, or caregivers, that they have the right information to share appropriately. And there's a way of helping facilitate that. And so as you walk into that commercialization and then the services that you're going to be providing to bring the patient advocacy groups along the entire process. I can't think of a process that you wouldn't want them to actually have some insight and knowledge and feedback around.
Thank you. One of the last topics we wanted to touch on is the big social media subject. So different organizations have different compliance tolerability for social media involvement, but clearly that's a tool for clinical trial awareness, recruitment, and then ultimately, even once therapies are available. How has Cure SMA used social media effectively, and what are some best practices?
So we definitely used it a lot. There's a big social media presence through our organization. We're an organization and we have Facebook and Twitter channels and things like that. But it's that links to so many other groups that are kind of grassroots family groups that are out there on social media as well. So I think we're always looking to push information out through social media. It's been very valuable in getting basic information, kind of awareness of activities out there. We always try to make sure that we're maintaining kind of credibility as an organization, that if we put information out, it's going to be accurate, it's going to be good information that somebody can rely on with looking at a clinical trial, what the criteria are. So I think it's that balance of you put something out, very informal, short on social media, trying to bring people back to us as an organization, our website and our materials for kind of the credibility side of it as well. So it definitely gets the awareness and then pulling people back into more kind of traditional
Do you
channels.
look for content generated from the manufacturer, or how does that piece of the process work? Do you want the information and then you develop the content?
Definitely information from the manufacturer from kind of what's out there formally on clinicaltrials.gov and information like that. So we look for that information to come to us. We'll repackage it in certain ways. Again, we'll probably link to the original sources, but we'll often try to repackage the information in the language that we know families are going to want to see it, to kind of have the criteria defined correctly in the language that our families normally use and can appreciate.
And the last topic we wanted to touch on before we go to questions is the caregiver piece. So in a lot of these discussions, we talk about the patient voice at the table, but it's often actually the caregivers that are representing that voice. So do you have unique approaches specifically targeted to caregivers that would be part of this bringing therapies into the clinic process?
So for us, the caregivers go all the way. It's the parents, the grandparents, and you start to get into kind of the professional care providers as well. They're all involved in our community. We're definitely, when we've built this community up, I think it's obviously the parents for us, but we've looked to have outreach to these kind of less connected caregiver members of our community. Obviously, they don't want as much information kind of on an ongoing basis when therapies are in development, but now we have at least the channels to get access to them. We've got a route to reach those caregivers that are not directly connected as well, and involve them in surveys and information as well.
And I think along those caregivers, it's really thinking about the different levels of caregiving. So for example, I'm a daughter, and so my mother lives in a different state, but I want to know what she's being diagnosed with. I want to understand what are the opportunities, how can I help facilitate her and her care. So I would be someone who would want to contact a patient advocacy group to get that information, help direct my mother in a local environment so that she can get the support and education that's necessary. I would also be looking to tap into that patient advocacy group. Can they be providing information at her level as well as for my level of understanding? You know, as a nurse, I'm going to go into more detail than she may want to know. So just things around with the caregiving.
I think one of the things that was interesting to me, and I don't actually have a good anecdote for what we did with it, but is how involved the grandparents are in the SMA community in particular. You know, when we to Kenneth's point, we've always receive the perspectives both from the individual affected with SMA, but their parents. And we really came to learn as we were going through this that the grandparents play such an integral role because they're backup care. Sometimes at the first point of diagnosis, they're more equipped to handle it than the parents are. So we've pulled those insights through more anecdotally than actually in the kind of hard data, more patient-driven data we were talking about earlier today. And I don't know how that will evolve, but it's definitely been a point for us to consider as we think about, how to reach the community, that we're not really, the community is so big beyond that one individual. It's not just the parents, it's the aunts and uncles and the grandparents. And I think was a little bit of a unique learning from you.
I think there's really a pearl to that, what you just said, and thank you, Jillian, that the backup caregiver too. If you think about a lot of these diseases affect people, they aren't able to go to work, and so their spouse can't always miss work. So who's that other person that comes into the mix, and what are they learning about the disease and the treatment and the management that could help inform the process for the company going along the way? So expanding our universe beyond just the patient and the caregiver, but what that whole nucleus looks like is really valuable. So. All right, we're going to open it up for questions. We're really privileged to have Jillian and Kenneth here. They've actually walked this story in SMA from the very early stages of the drug as a concept all the way through to now, hopefully very soon, having a therapy available for patients. So we all understand what that journey looks like, but if you have any specific questions, this is a really special opportunity for us.
Hi, I'm Sue Khan. I'm with National Tay-Sachs and Allied Diseases. And I have a question about data, because you use that word a lot. And so kind of a two-part question. From Jillian's perspective, what do you look for patient advocacy groups to be able to provide, in terms of data? And Kenneth, from your perspective, I know you said you started as a family support group, so you collect certain kinds of data. Obviously, some of it's confidential. So I was wondering, again, from your perspective, what kind of data are you talking about? And do you work with there's other SMA groups out there, so do you work with them so that if there's a registry or something that's really in common with all SMA families that are affected, that you can do together?
So I didn't really, prior to coming to Biogen, I was at BIO, the trade association, running their alliance development program, and I don't think I truly appreciated the meaning of data. People throw the word data around a lot, and I don't think I truly appreciated it until coming inside a company and realizing how data really drives all decisions. So, I think at the basic level, and particularly in rare disease, but really across all diseases, the natural history data, just to be able to compare what we expect, the day-to-day that we expect a patient to kind of go through versus when we're in the clinic, and how is that changing? So just the basic natural history data, I think, is so important. When you look at a disease like SMA, there's no approved therapy, so we really want to be able to have great natural history data to show to regulators and others what the natural course of that disease looks like. I think that's just an important baseline, early stage, every program we're looking for that type of data. And then I think, the patient preference data about benefit and risk is becoming, there's a lot of organizations that are doing these more formalized studies. I think that one thing that was really interesting, I was talking to a colleague about earlier, is that the FDA's IND acknowledgement letters now have a paragraph. These are template letters from the FDA that talk about how important patient preference data is, and tell companies you should be thinking about this. I think that's a huge shift, right? I think we've seen this shift over the past few years with the last round of PDUFA and patient-focused drug development meetings and all of the engagement that patient advocacy organizations have been driving. But you're seeing these things that are now just going to be the way it is moving forward. And so the fact that they're saying, do you have patient preference data? Have you considered it? Have you talk to patients about what this endpoint means to them and that type of thing? I think it's just, it goes back to that. It's a little bit of a long-winded question, but the more, or a long-winded answer, but the more data, the better. I've never been in a situation at Biogen where people have not asked for more.
And I think being able to communicate that need back to the patient advocacy organizations, I often hear patients express interest or desire for revised endpoints. And the reality is, because data drives so much of the decision making in the drug development process, there's sometimes a disconnect between validating a new endpoint and getting into the clinic, and helping the advocacy organizations be able to explain that to patients so that they understand they're being heard, but why it may not translate into tangible new endpoints right away. It's a process.
So what we were able to do was really starting from our membership database, which was really built from this kind of support model. We suddenly realized, and it was probably about 6 years ago, that this membership database was actually a really good data source for a lot of the goals that we had in moving therapeutic programs into the clinics. We'd actually built up a database of about 12,000 families that were affected, about another 100,000 of these kind of caregivers as well. And this was just built up through a support model. But that database, we kind of realized, now has information on the basic demographics of the disease, looking at the age of diagnosis, where people are located, the general kind of patient pathway that's in the database. It's not a patient registry, but it was just built up naturally, and it's there. And so now that's information that we, I think, initially used to show companies this was a tractable disease, that there are patients, there's families, there's ways to reach them to do therapeutic development. And then it became kind of a natural resource to provide not just summary demographics, but some de-identified data as well to show the different kind of stages of the disease, who could participate in clinical trials, where they were. And so we share both of those kind of levels, de-identified, but then just kind of summary demographics as well.
Hi, my name is Dave Caponero with Catalyst Pharmaceuticals. Since my friend Sue asked a two-part question, I have a two-part question. One is, we've talked about the patient advocacy groups. So what happens if you're working within a rare disease and there are no patient advocacy groups? Just wondered what your thoughts were on that. And then the second would be, talking about patient advocacy groups, is if there's already a therapy out there, yes, it's easy when a group is looking for that initial therapy, but how do you get them interested in a trial for a new therapy within the same disease?
Okay.
Great questions.
That's very, very good. So the first question is, if there's no patient advocacy organizations, I think, and you would have, but I think they tend to form when there are studies in the clinic, right? There is a driving need to have more information on what that study is measuring. I candidly have not worked in a disease state where there is not a patient advocacy organization. So I don't have a good, here is what you do. But I know you mentor probably other advocacy organizations and might have better insight than I do.
I think it's something we recommend to patient advocacy groups to get formed as soon as you can, because it's actually a catalyst to getting companies involved. I think we saw that a lot when companies were evaluating whether to do therapeutic development in SMA. One of the matrix kind of lines was, is there an active patient advocacy group? Is that going to be there to provide the information? Is it going to be there to help with recruitment? So I think we put that out as an encouragement. The sooner the better that you can form advocacy groups, that's going to kind of catalyze this industry interest in coming in and getting involved.
And anything you can do to help organize. So in almost every rare disease I've worked in, there are very vocal parent advocates, and they develop core strengths as they go through their journey, but being able to get them organized beyond a fundraising focus, which is very critically important, but into the research and influencing manufacturers and companies into what they're going to pursue from a research development process, can be very effective.
And I do think that there's patient advocacy groups there. They're just not publicly known. They're in little community settings. They're beating down the barriers as best they can, but they are not organized. And to your point, Wendy, that's exactly what needs to happen.
In rare disease, what I tell the parents that I meet who maybe aren't even affiliated with an advocacy organization is to go to organizations like Global Genes and other umbrella groups that provide a lot of capacity building, because those summits and seminars just provide so much value. And then we have 1 minute left, but for your question, I do have colleagues that work in therapeutic areas where there are, therapies on the market. Again, they work directly with the patient advocacy organizations to figure out lessons learned for the recruitment of clinical trials, how to tweak them based on the fact that there is an approved therapy. I don't, it's a key consideration, just like all of the others that we've talked about, but it's just the direct early engagement with the advocacy organizations that's going to make you successful in that space, I think.
No, absolutely, I agree. And I do think that the advocacy groups, even though there may be a drug in the market that's available, they're always looking for the better drug for their patient population. So I think giving them an opportunity, they will carry the banner.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. Thank you for traveling in. Thank you for sharing all of your insights with us. It really is very helpful and meaningful, and we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, leave these on.